We've had a lot of discussion on this subject matter, and we'll continue to have a great bit of discussion as we should. I just want to provide a few contextual comments before Dan Lenahan comes on, who's our Director of T&D Planning and Strategy. And really this conversation started in its infancy in 2019. And it started with what you might recall was power with purpose. And Dan will get into this piece of the conversation, but back in 2019, we were looking at the 2024 system. And we identified that our 2024 system, based on decreasing capacity contracts, a growing community, and our planned changes at North Omaha, we were not going to be able to do those without a significant change in our resources. And in that conversation in 2019, and we're going to get a chance to relive some of it today, we talked about that there were specific things that needed to be restored on our system. And specifically, there needed to be a restoration of reliability and resiliency. And so in 2019, as we considered the solutions that we would deploy, both on the generation side as well as on the demand side management, we were guided by some pretty specific things. We were guided by electrical engineering truths. We were guided by power system modeling tools. We were guided by reliability standards. We were guided by the operating history of the types of events that can occur in eastern Nebraska and the impacts that they have on our system. So as we saw in our models, the changes to North Omaha in 2023, we saw a degraded system, and the solution for that system need is power with purpose. And if you recall, this will push a lot of you, I think, but there was some dialogue in the power with purpose discussion that said, how many solutions did you consider before we got to the recommendation of natural gas and solar? And we considered over 70 million. And we talked a great deal about that back in the 2019 timeframe. Some of those solutions were excluded because they couldn't be put in service fast enough. Some of those solutions were excluded because they didn't solve the reliability problem. And the list goes on and on for how we whittled down 70 million. But we're coming to a point in the organization's history where if we don't get the sequence of events correct, we expect an unfavorable system outcome. And Dan will talk about the specifics of that, and he'll use the term blackout. And I want people to understand that we have been watching this over the last few years. We have been fervently deploying the solutions that are available to us to try and avoid this, to get the sequence of events lined up in the right chronological order and have them occur at the right time. And ultimately, because of events outside of the control of OPPD, we're left with a decision, and Dan will talk more about this. But if you haven't been along for the totality of the conversation, and your memory's like mine, where you think about 2019 and you have a hard time bringing that back to your head and heart, I wanted to set that context that we've been on this journey, that we're playing the long game, that we're focusing on system reliability and doing the right things in the right way at the right sequence to get the right outcomes. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Lenahan, and he'll navigate us through the conversation today.
Thanks, Brad, for that introduction. So again, I'm Dan Lenahan, Director of System Planning here at OPPD, and just do a quick audio video check. You can hear and see me, correct? Excellent. Okay. So the slide you see here is a brief outline or agenda of what will be discussed today. So I presented on this topic pretty in depth a couple months ago at our June board committee meeting. So I'm going to start off this presentation with a recap of that material, as that includes some critical context for which the recommendation before you is being made. Also, after that presentation, after we gave that presentation at that June board committee meeting, we stated we would initiate stakeholder outreach efforts along with soliciting customer feedback, which we have done, and we'll summarize those results here today, along with providing some material in response to some of that customer feedback we received. And then finally, I'll just end with a summary of this information along with the recommendation at hand. So if you go to the next slide, start with the recap of the meeting. Thanks. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of background on Power with Purpose. Brad alluded to some of that, since some folks may be tuning into this topic for the first time today. So the Power with Purpose project was born out of a rigorous generation and transmission grid planning effort that culminated with a recommendation to our board of directors in the fall of 2019, so almost 3 years ago, to add up to 1,200 megawatts of new bulk power generation to the power grid, where approximately half of that would consist of utility scale solar and the other half would consist of natural gas generation. And this recommended generation portfolio optimally balanced affordability, reliability, and environmental sensitivity. And so I extracted some materials and graphics from that October 2019 public board meeting presentation on our Power with Purpose recommendation, which you can see on the slide here. And we communicated the Power with Purpose project was initiated to facilitate three main things. First, Power with Purpose generation plan will support replacing aging power generation on our system located at our North Omaha station. A few years ago, we initiated a transition plan to cease coal operation at that station and partially fuel convert some of the units from coal to natural gas. And to date, we have converted roughly half the station's capacity from coal to natural gas, with ultimate plans to retire the 3 oldest units there and fuel convert the remaining 2 units from coal to natural gas by the end of 2023, thus ceasing all coal operation at the site. In addition to facilitating the planned retirements and refueling at North Omaha Station, the Power with Purpose project facilitates very large electric load growth that we forecast coming on our system in the next few years. And the graph in the middle of the slide shows our projected electric load growth indicated by that ascending orange arrow, along with our declining generation supply, primarily due to the planned retirements at North Omaha Station, which are indicated in the gray shaded area in that graph. And there's an orange space in between the load growth line on the top of the graph and the generation supply in gray in the bottom of the graph. And there's a gap there, which represents a generation supply deficiency. And if that gap is left unmitigated, we would not have enough power generation supply to meet our forecasted electric demand. And the Power with Purpose generation project will fill that gap. In addition to filling that gap, Power with Purpose generation will also maintain critical and historical local grid reliability and resiliency levels. And in our 2019 board meeting materials, we shared and discussed those other 2 graphics on the slide here, which referenced the changing generation landscape in and around us, in and around our system, along with our experiences to some extreme weather events, such as tornadoes, flooding, polar vortexes. We talked about how those 2 items are challenging our ability to maintain the reliability and resiliency of the grid. And we stated that if these items were left unchecked, our local grid reliability and resiliency margins would decline to an unacceptable level, leaving our system prone to potential large-scale blackouts. And the Power with Purpose generation plan will maintain and restore those grid reliability and resiliency margins to help avoid those blackouts, while also serving our projected load growth and replacing aging power generation on our system. So with our planned generation retirements and refueling plans at North Omaha Station and the generation expansion plans with Power with Purpose, this creates a scenario where there's a significant amount of bulk power generation changes that are set to occur, where the coordination of decommissioning and commissioning dates for these generation changes becomes critical for successful project outcomes and maintaining grid reliability and resiliency. So upon approval by the board for Power with Purpose in the fall of 2019, we started on project execution for the project. But over the last year, we began to experience some pretty significant challenges and events, which are being shared by many other electric utilities across our industry, which I will now like to discuss on the next slide here. So maybe before I dive into these industry challenges, I think it's important to either remind folks or inform folks of the interconnected nature of the power grid and what that really means. So high voltage transmission power lines are what are used to move bulk power over long distances. And these transmission lines are what are connect cities to cities and states to states together across the country, thus creating a vast network of interconnected power lines, commonly referred to as the power grid. There are on-ramps created on this grid to connect new large power plants, and there are off-ramps created to distribute power locally. So due to the complexity and interconnected nature of the power grid, it is heavily regulated by the federal government from both a grid reliability perspective and a wholesale power market perspective, which requires a ton of regional coordination and oversight to be put in place to monitor, evaluate, and approve any bulk power grid transactions and or any major changes to any portion of the interconnected power grid. So that background is really important to help understand some of these industry challenges I'm going to walk through now as they relate to adding new power generation and retiring legacy power generation on the grid. So the first industry challenge I want to cover is the changing generation landscape, or more commonly referred to in the industry as the changing resource mix. So as we identified back in 2019, the power generation landscape was drastically changing in our subregion along the Missouri River corridor, involving the retirement of legacy conventional generators such as coal and nuclear, and adding a lot of variable energy resources in the form of renewable energy. And this dynamic started to present new challenges on our subregional grid in maintaining reliability and resiliency. And these new challenges were also being identified in many other parts of the country. Therefore, our federal regulator, NERC, or North American Electric Reliability Corporation, who oversees grid reliability in the United States, issued a warning. And that warning stated that the pace at which these generation changes are occurring could lead to significant grid reliability concerns and large-scale blackouts. The graphic in the upper right here on the slide is extracted from a recent NERC assessment, which highlighted various regions spanning over half the country where these concerns are elevated. And in some regions, not OPPD's region, during the summer, they experienced some significant challenges trying to avoid generation supply shortages. So this reliability risk is very real and present in our industry today. Due to this grid reliability risk, regional grid authorities are starting to require more power generation reserves to be put in place, along with stricter requirements for reliability performance for power generators on the grid, which is impacting generation expansion plans and generation retirement plans for many entities. A second set of industry challenges I wanted to discuss specifically focus on new solar generation. So earlier this year, the federal government opened what's known as an anti-circumvention investigation, where they're investigating if certain entities are bypassing laws or regulations around solar panel imports into the US. And this investigation has essentially brought the solar supply chain to a pseudo standstill as this investigation continues. In addition to that, there have been a lot of siting challenges for solar, where zoning jurisdictions are passing moratoriums blocking utility scale solar development, either to discourage solar development altogether or to temporarily pause solar development so that new solar regulations can be developed, as utility scale solar technology is new to many zoning jurisdictions, and we ran into both situations locally. Third set of industry challenges I want to talk about involves connecting new generation to the grid. Interconnecting any new generation to the grid is a heavily regulated process by the federal government, and those regulations are administered by various regional entities across the country. As part of those regulations, any new generator requesting to interconnect to the grid is required to formally establish its queue position or get its place in line, and then go through a formal interconnection request evaluation study process to ensure the federal grid reliability standards are maintained. And this process actually worked very well until relatively recently. New generator grid interconnection requests have skyrocketed across the entire country the past few years, creating a landscape where each region's interconnection request studies are severely log jammed and backlogged by multiple years. which are quickly becoming a major impediment to adding new generation to the grid in a timely manner. So if you see the graphic in the lower right-hand part of the slide there, there's a map of the US showing each region's backlog generation interconnection requests, the thousands of megawatts of new generation requests waiting to be evaluated. And the amount of new generation requests that are waiting in backlogged queues would more than double the nameplate capacity of the entire existing generation fleet in the US. And the transmission grid that's been built out over the years was not built out to support the likes of any of the things we're seeing now here. So now, not all of these requests in this backlog will come to fruition, and many of them are actually speculative in nature at this point. But due to federal policy on requiring open access to the transmission grid for any requests and treating all requests in a non-discriminatory manner, each request must be studied and processed. So a little bit about the regulated grid studies. So these regulated grid reliability impact studies are complex electrical engineering computer modeling simulations, which really determine transmission grid expansion requirements for these new generation interconnection requests. And the more requests that are included in these studies, along with the composition of those requests, mostly consisting of emerging renewable energy technologies, makes these grid evaluation studies that much more complex and that much more time consuming. So it's due to this dynamic, interconnection request processing durations in each region across the country have almost doubled from what was once an average of maybe 1 to 2 years in processing time has now extended to 4+ years all over the place. And furthermore, compounding the issue, larger transmission grid expansion requirements are being identified in these studies, which also potentially further delays the ability of new generators to come online, as they are not only waiting for the backlog grid impact studies to get completed, but they're also potentially having to wait on large transmission grid infrastructure to get built before they can fully operate their power plant on the grid. So as a result of that challenge and all the other challenges I mentioned on the slide, there's numerous examples of electric utilities across the entire country that are being forced to defer their generation expansion plans, which is also then forcing deferment of generation retirement plans as well in order to maintain grid reliability and resiliency. So how does all this relate to OPPD's Power with Purpose project? Well, unfortunately, our project is not immune to these challenges, and we're dealing with all of these as well. And if you go to the next slide, I can dive a bit deeper on that. So similar to other electric utilities, OPPD has plans to retire, refuel, and expand our generation portfolio. And specifically, we had longstanding plans to retire our oldest 3 units at North Omaha Station and then convert and refuel the remaining 2 units there from coal to natural gas. And all these changes were set to occur by the end of 2023. And the Power with Purpose generation assets were largely planned to be put in service prior to those North Omaha Station changes occurring. However, we're running into those same industry events and challenges I just discussed on the previous slide, which is impacting our Power with Purpose generation project, with the most impactful challenge being the multi-year study backlog and the regulated generation interconnection request evaluation process for new grid interconnections. So OPPD is part of the Southwest Power Pool, or SPP region, who is responsible for overseeing the regulated grid interconnection process in this region. And that SPP region is highlighted in red on the map shown to the right there. And similar to every region in the country, SPP's interconnection process is significantly backlogged and delayed, which is impacting our Power with Purpose generation and service dates. So one thing important to note is that interconnection to the grid cannot be denied, but it does require a grid reliability impact study be completed first, and that is what is severely backlogged due to the volume of requests in the region. So due to the significance of this impact, we just wanted to unpack this challenge in a little bit more detail in the bottom half of the slide. So the graphic in the lower right shows a timeline of how our Power with Purpose gas generation interconnection requests are progressing through the federally regulated SPP administered generation interconnection study process, illustrating how that study process has evolved and been delayed more over time. So at a high level, wherever you see a gray colored bar in that timeline graphic indicates the original estimated duration for Power with Purpose gas generation interconnection requests to work their way through the regulated study process, noting that the original timeline would have had us completing the SPP interconnection study by the end of 2023 before the North Omaha generation retirements and fuel conversions were set to occur. And wherever you see a colored bar in that graph that's orange, green, or red, that's the updated portion of how the SPP interconnection process has evolved and been significantly delayed more due to the generation interconnection landscapes I just talked about. So we implemented numerous mitigation plans in an attempt to minimize the impact of this study backlog, which I just wanted to discuss briefly. So first, OPPD submitted our Power with Purpose interconnection request to SPP in early 2020 and strategically cited those resources to help minimize transmission grid build-out. And at that time, it was estimated our request would be processed well ahead of our planned in-service dates. And also at that time, there were relatively minimal amounts of transmission network upgrade build-out requirements that were being identified in these studies, notably for requests near our subregion. So since then, the SPP interconnection study backlog landscape drastically changed. Request processing times more than doubled from what was once 2 years, now ballooned up to 4 to 5 years. In addition to that, massive long lead regional transmission network upgrade build-out requirements are starting to be identified, which are pushing interconnection service dates out even further. So due to this growing study backlog, SPP developed a short-term option called interim interconnection service to allow generator projects the potential option to bridge a gap until the final interconnection study is complete. And we began pursuing that option. However, that interim interconnection option is challenged as well, and we received initial interim system impact study results earlier this year that had multiple issues to work through. And even if we successfully work through all those issues, there's going to be perpetuating risk with this option, as interim service is only a short-term product and it is reevaluated at least annually. And upon reevaluation, this service can be revoked or taken away due to changing grid conditions. Therefore, this interim service option cannot on its own be relied upon to mitigate our grid reliability and resiliency concerns. So despite all these mitigation efforts, the backlog generation interconnection process has not been resolved for our Power with Purpose generation project, and a new mitigation plan needs to be considered, or our applications are pending evaluation. If you go to the next slide.
Dan, I apologize. I did say brief questions, but related to SPP, can you talk a little bit about some of the other changes in SPP's process aside from the interim status that will hopefully accelerate some of the existing projects and avoid this problem continuing? Because as we look forward, we have significant new resources that will need to come online over the coming years and decades. What else has SPP done to avoid this problem spilling forward in time?
Yes, thanks for the question, Director Williams. So SPP saw this backlog growing and they initiated various process reviews to try and make their process more efficient to get to their backlog quicker. And so each of the year over the past couple of years, they've initiated multiple changes. Some changes came internally from SPP staff, but they are also a very stakeholder-driven organization, which we are obviously members of and participate in all their working group committees to talk about things like this. And many of the stakeholders offered up potential solutions for them to mitigate some of these backlog issues, and they've implemented various measures to do that as well. And so it is probably one of the biggest topics that is discussed at all the SPP working groups on a monthly basis. So there's a ton of stuff in flight to try and review this and make it more efficient. I think one potential light at the end of the tunnel is the federal government has also elevated this as a top issue to deal with, and that would be the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And they are looking at potentially changing their federal policy about how this stuff is processed, because SPP is simply following the federal process for how they're supposed to do these studies. But I'm sure, as you know, any federal policy changes can't take place overnight. So the changes that are getting discussed nationally probably won't work their way into these kind of processes until months, if not potentially years later. But there are some short-term measures that SPP's changed to mitigate some of the backlog. And some examples include requiring different types of financial security requirements for application requests to potentially weed out maybe those that are more speculative in nature versus those that maybe have more land control and site control to move forward with their projects. So those are just a couple examples. So hopefully I answered your question there.
If I may, and I see Joe Lang just turned his camera on, so maybe Joe can expand on this a little bit more. I remain hopeful that officials at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, have these as one of their top priorities. They know about this problem. It's not unique to OPPD or the Midwest. It's something that is prevalent around, across the United States. They have since, I think, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, they've already issued advance notice of public rulemaking to try to start modifying the rules to change regulations at the federal level that would then enable the regional transmission organizations to expedite this process. Now, as you can imagine, federal regulations are neither easy nor fast, so that takes some time. I remain hopeful that future queues, future applications will benefit from these new regulations. Right. The problem that we have right now is we are dealing with existing applications that were filed in the past, and that we have to follow existing regulations. So to answer your question, Director Williams, I know these will get better. It will get better because it's not just OPPD, it's utilities across the country asking for help, asking for the process to be changed. We know that the rules are already started to be discussed for changes, but it's the speed of those changes and the nature of those changes won't necessarily affect the queue positions that we have for our power with purpose projects. Joe, anything I missed?
No, you hit it well, Javier, and Dan certainly as well too. Just in addition, certainly Director Glick, the chairman of FERC, he's noted this as his most important item at FERC, and so I'd love to know and that he's been receptive and he understands that this is a national issue and is put a lot of pressure on FERC staff to seek to address this. And we've had a lot of discussions with FERC staff to give them thoughts as well to address this. Director Williams, to your question, kind of directly to your question, we reviewed this with the board, but for others, certainly the biggest aspect here is the previous generation interconnection process in essence didn't have a limited opportunities for requests to revoke and pull out of the process. And so in essence, what that does, that unlimited excuse me, those unlimited opportunities allows those applicants, when they pull out, it causes SPP to have to restudy the pool. And when they do that, it just drags on, and they're given 30 days to request their to rescind, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a big timing variable that occurs. And so as Dan was hitting on, what SPP has implemented that will help significantly, and we'll go into why it will help, but not immediately, the 3-phase process. And so applications have 3 opportunities to get out, and it's a very defined structure. And so it just doesn't drag on and on and on. The issue, even though SPP has implemented this new process, these generation interconnection applications, the backlog is all these requests that are grandfathered into the old process. And they like to be in that old process because it gives them more flexibility to get out whenever they want, and it doesn't limit them. And so as that backlog is being cleared over the next 4 or 5 years or so, unfortunately, they're grandfathered in that process, and we have to wait for that backlog to clear before the new process will become implemented by SPP and utilized.
Yeah, I appreciate the clarification. I didn't mean to imply that the change would impact this project, but just looking forward, as our decarb study identified, another 1,000 megawatts of solar in the next 10 years. I want to make sure that we are looking into how our resource planning is preparing for that. And in the alphabet soup, everybody cheer for the FERC NOPR on GIA. Am I right? Woo! All right. And Director Moody, do you have additional comments?
Yeah, and this may this may be a tangent. So if so, please just stop it and we'll move on. How does the Department of Energy's grid deployment office play into this? Is that something separate that's really examining macro level, or not relevant? Relevant? Just kind of curious.
It is very relevant. It is certainly informing the Secretary of Energy of the needs that exist across the country, and that coordination is necessary with FERC in order for FERC to develop policy. So all of these federal efforts are tied together.
Okay.
I know that, I have lots of connections back with the Department of Energy from my former job, and I can tell you there is significant work underway by all of these agencies within the Department of Energy to understand the need and carefully consider different policy. As you know, federal policy is incredibly important, and they need to consider all the positive and negative effects of the proposed policy making. So this is what this office is doing right now.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. If we can continue forward, appreciate the slight diversion.
Perfect. No problem. If we want to, yeah, thanks for going to the next slide here. So said a lot the last few slides. So just trying to quickly summarize what I said there. So the Power with Purpose Generation Expansion Plan was originally intended to largely be put in service by the fall of 2023 to facilitate the North Omaha Station transition, to support our growing communities, and to maintain local grid reliability and resiliency. The same industry events and challenges that are impacting generation retirement and expansion plans all across the country are impacting us and causing delays with Power with Purpose. In order to ensure OPPD's grid reliability and resiliency margins are preserved to help prevent large-scale blackouts, a mitigation plan for Power with Purpose generation delays is recommended to be put in place. And based on the magnitude of the generation portfolio changes and the local and national challenges, there are very few options that are available that can be satisfactorily executed within the time frame needed. And if you go to the next slide. So we presented a couple options at the last June meeting that we had for consideration, which I'll just go through real quickly here. So option one, this is to basically move forward with the North Omaha transition plan as originally planned, which would be retire units 1, 2, and 3 at North Omaha Station and convert the remaining units there, 4 and 5, from coal to natural gas by the end of 2023. And also, as part of this option, we would attempt to import a significant amount of power from other generators located on the regional power grid to supplement that generation supply deficiency. So this option has the beneficial environmental impact of reducing emissions at North Omaha Station. However, as mentioned previously in this presentation, the Power with Purpose project was intended to facilitate this North Omaha Station transition. But with Power with Purpose being delayed due to those industry challenges and events I just discussed, proceeding with the North Omaha Station transition as previously planned would lead to significant grid reliability and resiliency impacts. So particularly our voltage stability and import capability, which are both electrical properties that need to have margin to keep the grid operational, would be more than cut in half, reducing to approximately 60% of current levels, leaving the OPPD system degraded and in an unacceptable condition, susceptible to large-scale blackouts. So we also had an option two. And option two was to defer our plans at the North Omaha Station for a temporary period until we get certainty for our Power with Purpose gas generation to inject into the grid and operate. So this option would defer the reduction of emissions from North Omaha Station for a temporary period. But this option has the benefit of maintaining grid reliability and resiliency, or in other words, to help keep the power flowing to our community, which includes hospitals, fire and police stations, and other critical facilities for maintaining public health and safety. The district will need to make additional investments for extending the operation at North Omaha Station. Those investments are estimated to be offset by the anticipated regional wholesale market revenues generated by the station. So considering the two options presented here, staff recommends option two for extending North Omaha Station for a temporary period. And on the next slide, I'm going to unpack more what I mean by that temporary period. So if we want to go to the next slide here, thank you. So again, there's a lot of information on the slide here, but we felt it was necessary to try and provide as much detail as possible around the conditions for which we would recommend this temporary extension at North Omaha Station and its current capability. And I'm just going to start off by reading the specific language for the recommendation here. So to ensure grid reliability and resiliency, extend North Omaha Station in its current capability for a temporary period until all conditions and milestones, including but not limited to transmission network upgrade requirements as set forth in the executed generation interconnection and transmission service agreements for power with purpose gas generation have been satisfied. Okay, so what does that really mean? Well, just notice the words that current capability that are underlined and bolded in that first bullet point. So just as a reminder, North Omaha Station's current capability means that units 1, 2, and 3 operate on gas, and units 4 and 5 primarily operate on coal. Also, current capability does not mean we operate the units exactly like we have in the past. Rather, it means they need to be capable of operating like they have in the past to preserve our grid reliability and resiliency when called upon. Also, for planning purposes, we need to prepare for extension of North Omaha Station in its current capability until the end of 2026. But the extension could be terminated earlier, before then, or it could be extended further past then, pending what the Southwest Power Pool service agreement milestones are. We anticipate receiving those SPP service agreements by late 2024, early 2025 timeframe. So upon completion of those service agreements, we will reevaluate the North Omaha Station extension for potential termination prior to the end of 2026 or further extension pending what the final SPP transmission network upgrade build-out requirements are and how long those transmission upgrade network upgrades would take to build. So also as part of the plan to extend North Omaha Station operations, we would attempt to balance environmental impacts and reliability needs by exploring possible options to minimize North Omaha Station unit emissions if system conditions allow, along with continuing to pursue interim grid interconnection service for our power with purpose generation. We will continue to advocate for energy regulatory policy reform for new grid interconnections regionally and nationally, as we have done in the past. And in addition to temporarily extending North Omaha Station, we would also plan to expand large customer demand response programs, primarily for commercial and industrial customers. We would continue to pursue our critical power with purpose utility scale solar resources. And in accordance with our Powering the Future 2050 efforts, we intend to engage with local education and community organizations to pursue efforts to improve overall impacts for Omaha residents. Okay, so now that I've gone through the recommendation, I'm just going to pause a quick second and scan and see if there's any quick questions before I'm going to transition to a next slide on why we need to start those preparations now.
Hey, Dan, if it's okay, appreciate the pause for discussion. Let's go ahead and get the next slide, and then we'll maybe pause for a little comment.
Okay. So yeah, thanks, Brad. I think after this next slide, there's a natural breaking point for questions. So in this slide here, so why do we need to start these preparations for the temporary extension now? Well, the reason we need to begin now is that the decision to extend operations at North Omaha Station cannot be made on a month-to-month or even a year-to-year basis, as there are various factors involved in extending the operation of North Omaha Station that require long lead multi-year preparations, and I've listed some of those long lead items here. So first of which is staffing. So review of critical staffing requirements to operate the station and its current capabilities currently in progress. And the qualifications and training required to operate the station takes several years to obtain. So a thoughtful and careful approach to maintain adequate staffing levels is required. Also, there's going to be additional maintenance and capital improvement work needed, which I alluded to earlier. And so using your car as an analogy, just like you need to perform maintenance and replace older equipment in your car for extended operation, so must we do too for a power plant. And planning and coordinating that work during limited planned outage durations requires a lot of long lead time preparations.
Hey, Dan, really quick, just to interject a little bit on the staffing piece. it is important for us as we think about staffing at North Omaha Station. Of course, our plan had been all along for that station to transition in 2024. Right now, that plan is potentially changing by a few years. It is important for us to remember that we also are building 2 new generation stations. So the staffing piece becomes really critical here because there were a lot of plans for us to transition some employees that could elect to transition outside of North Omaha Station and start working at one of the 2, Standing Bear Lake Station or Turtle Creek Station. So we have to be very careful about staffing the new generation appropriately, getting licensed, experienced operators, which are not easy to come by. And at the same time, now we have the added challenge of keeping even more, keeping a higher number of operators at the North Omaha Station if we are going to extend this. So the staffing piece, I want to underscore how important it is for us to have that long lead time to adequately have staffing all sorted out and training if there's need of training and certification that may need to happen for certain operators. That takes time. So it's not just staffing in North Omaha Station, it's compounded by the 2 new stations that we're building. Sorry, Dan, go ahead.
No, thanks, Javier. Great context as usual. So just to maybe round out this slide on a couple more points here. So there's also going to be additional long lead time for additional fuel acquisition, along with environmental permitting considerations. And our environmental regulatory affairs and energy production teams are going to be continuing strong partnership with our regulators to ensure sufficient regulatory margin and permit compliance for this recommended change. So I believe that concludes the recap section of what we talked about in the June 22 board committee presentation in this topic. And so now we can maybe pause to see if there's any additional questions before we kind of transition to the external communication and customer feedback section.
Great, thanks very much. Director Spurgeon.
This may harken back to Mr. Underwood's comments this morning. I'm struck reading one of the slides that option 1 will result in a 60% decrease in reliability. Can you help me understand how 3 gas generations plants and 2 coal can result in such a striking reduction? Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a ton of electrical engineering, computer modeling, simulation analysis that goes into this, but not to get into any of that level of depth. I think maybe the way to explain it is location on the grid for power injection points has significant impacts to how reliable that grid is and how the grid operates. So the location for the North Omaha Station units being kind of located with, I'll call it in the Omaha proper area load pocket, is a critical generation source to keep the power on in the area. And I'm sure, as you know, our power with purpose gas assets we're planning to add are going to be located in the Omaha proper area load pocket. And so it's the location of the generating assets and the dispatchability of the assets that's important to maintaining that grid reliability and resiliency. Because without those assets in our system, we have to more significantly rely on our transmission line interconnections to our neighbors, which I talked about earlier, as we're all part of a vast interconnected network. And so there are certain limitations on how much power you can import into an area before the electrical properties of the system start to break down. So that hopefully that unpacks that in a bit more depth on just how impactful location of generation in our load pocket can be to maintain the reliability of our local grid.
And if it's okay, and Director Spurgeon, I'll give an analogy on voltage. You know, if you were out using your water in the summer and the water stopped coming out and you looked in the hose and you could see the water, but it wasn't coming out. We like to analogize voltage on the electric system to water pressure on the water system. And what happens is if you lose that pressure on the system will collapse. And so I think what Dan did a really nice job of articulating is even if you wanted to import power, you have to have the right voltage on the system to allow your system to be able to import. And I think that's a really important point. So Dan, I don't know if you'd add or take anything away to that, but I think that helps people kind of understand the situation the operators would be in, where the system's not doing what the system needs to do. And that's fundamentally a problem.
I think you hit it appropriately, Brad. I mean, without going into any more deeper levels of depth on voltage, thermal overload, system stability, I think that analogy of the water pressure to voltage is a very good one to use there.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I'll go in order that I saw them. Director Yoder.
I have a couple of questions. So we talked about the costs of the upgrade necessary, and on the slide, I think it talks about cost versus market revenues. So I want to make sure we got all the costs included there, and so you specifically referred to maintenance and capital investments. Is that it primarily, or are there other costs that are included or are not
Scott,
included?
I think, oops, sorry to clip you unintentionally there, Director Yoder. Thank you for your question. Scott, I think you'll have some great comments here for the type of capital that needs to be deployed, but I think the way I would answer it conceptually is it's a different set of costs to cease operations at a facility or refuel than it is to extend the life of a facility and its current capability. So the team's been spending a good couple of months here calibrating this. The costs that we're articulating are around all the capital infrastructure that's required, the fuel that's required, the operations staff that's required, the consumables that are required at the facility. It's really all of those types of costs that we would consider within a resource planning decision. And we're comparing those against to the market revenues of the facility. So I don't know, Scott, if you would add anything more. You have better visibility to the specifics, most likely. But
no, Brad, I think that's a great summary of what the review's been done and the results that we've obtained.
A couple of drilling down just a little bit. So we've got an ash landfill out there, and so if we're going to extend the operations, then we're extending the life of that landfill, and so there's some bonding obligations, I think, for that, or some kind of financial performance capabilities that go beyond the life of our plant and are tied with that. Are those some of the things that you're including in this?
yeah, any sort of post combustion component costs for storage or other would be included.
Yeah, so those are being extended, and there's a time value of money and other costs that are associated with that. Great. Great. So another question I have. So thank you very much, and thanks for being on top of that stuff. Another question I have on a different slide. Do you talk about balancing environmental impacts and reliability needs by exploring the possible operations to minimize coal emissions? So first question, what are the environmental impacts you're thinking of here?
Yeah, I think this is a nod, Director Yoder, to the strategic direction the district is on to reduce emissions over time and the customer interest in that. And so when we talk about the context of this decision within our net zero goal of 2050, what we're trying to say is there is an extension of the station in its current capability, and there are emissions considerations within that decision. And we are trying to balance those issues while we march to our long-term strategic goal.
Yeah, so I hear you referencing Strategic Directive 7, and then the emissions that I then understand you to be talking about are carbon emissions. Is that correct?
Yeah, we publish our emissions online, but most folks are familiar with CO2.
Okay, and then kind of tied into this is, are there other ways to minimize those environmental impacts other than minimizing North Omaha Station coal unit emissions?
Yeah, I think we have information a little bit later in the deck that talks about the framework of market rules and system needs relative to how we're operating the asset, and so we might be able to touch on that in a few moments if I followed your question correctly, sir.
Okay, well, I'll certainly raise my voice if not. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Great. Director Moloff?
Thank you. Earlier, you had said that interconnection cannot be denied. So can you help me understand then what would be the consequences if we went ahead and interconnected our gas plants and went ahead with this decommissioning or this the changes up in North Omaha? What would be the consequences if we just went ahead on our own, connected our gas plants to the grid within our district, and then proceeded to shut down North Omaha as we had previously planned?
Yeah, great question, Director Mulhall. So the reason these policies and requirements are in place is to protect overall reliability of the bulk grid across the country. If people or entities started connecting or disconnecting facilities without going through these proper evaluations, that's what can lead to significant issues if those type of changes on the grid aren't coordinated. And when I say significant issues, this is where we get into large scale blackouts. So if the system is not properly assessed or set up to accommodate a new interconnection or accommodate a retired interconnection, that's where we have significant concerns, which is why the whole grid is super regulated and we have all these processes in place. So when I say we can't be denied interconnection, we cannot be denied interconnection, but there is going to be a time frame with which we have to have a reliability assessment done, and the transmission system needs to demonstrate it can accommodate that interconnection request first.
Right. So great distinction, Dan and Director Molhoff. I think this is exactly to the heart of the question. It's the Southwest Power Pool cannot deny our connection, but they can tell us not quite yet, right? They will say there are a few investments, transmission infrastructure investments that are necessary in order for you to connect. And so the danger here is we have our two new gas generation stations, Turtle Creek Station and Starting Bear Lake Station, ready, up and going, energized in 2024. We have an interim generation interconnection. We start generating, and then a year later, let's say in 2025, the Southwest Power Pool comes back with their final generation study and they say, you have to turn those off. There's too much risk in the system. There are a few more infrastructure investments that need to be completed before you can turn that on. So they would not deny us, but they would ask us to temporarily shut them down. At that point, if we had already proceeded with the conversion of North Omaha Station, we would be without that the capacity that units 1, 2, and 3 North Omaha currently provide, and we would immediately lose also the capability that we would have from Standing Bear Lake Station and Turtle Creek Station. That is an untenable solution. And this is going back to the question about the 60% degradation in the system reliability. That would put us in an incredibly weak point where we could be the cause of regional blackouts at that point. So I hope that helps explain the answer about the SPP cannot deny it, but they can postpone it, and that is a risk that is not that is one that our engineers do not recommend taking.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the explanation.
I've seen a hand up and down from Director Moody.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm ready. I think it's piggyback on what Janice just asked about from a transmission improvement and upgrade standpoint. As we talked about this morning, we're already taking measures based on the 2 natural gas facilities we're working on, so we're being very proactive. I know that we won't know until we see the results of the study, but what I'm kind of curious about is, Brad, as you described it, we're handling sort of what's in our territory, but there are implications outside of our territory that they need to consider as far as grid improvements. I'm curious about how much of that is going to be out of our control once those are identified. So in other words, study is completed. They've articulated what the transmission upgrades need to be. Do we have any sense for, okay, now we've got to take those steps in order to connect? Transmission upgrades are required. Any gut check on how much of that is going to be within our control versus outside of our control?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to estimate, but Dan, I would ask for your voice here from an engineering perspective, and it's probably worth highlighting who the TO is, who the TO isn't, and how these infrastructure needs can be identified. It may not even be on the OPPD system, and Dan, I think, can be able to speak to that. But Dan, would you add anything to the conversation?
I think you articulated that well. So again, SPP has been likened to like an air traffic controller for the region. And so we're pretty confident on what our local grid conditions need to be expanded upon to support the new infrastructure on our system. It's what's going around our system and other utilities in other parts of Nebraska, parts of Iowa, parts of the Dakotas, parts of Kansas that can impact different areas of the grid. And that's kind of the SPP more regional review, that they have the latest and greatest information from across the region. And when I talked about before, there's these thousands of megawatts of generators in the backlog. There is significant impacts of the grid of which one of those generators decides to go forward or not. And that's what makes this thing so difficult to predict, is we don't know which ones are going to go forward that are ahead of us in the queue. If we did, we wouldn't be having much of this discussion today. And that really is the crux of this. That's the unknown of the transmission build out and why these studies take so long to do, because there's a huge backlog of requests. And each request has to be processed in kind of the order in which it was received. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I don't know if I got to your question or not.
Yeah, that did. Let me, if I could just ask a quick follow-up. I think we saw that MISO announced a pretty significant transmission expansion plan. Is the result of an SPP study something that's that significant in magnitude, or are we taking it kind of a few at a time? I'm just kind of curious about how much planning is involved over the whole system versus in pockets or regions and certain circuits or what have you.
Yeah, so SPP does do long range planning, and they do take into account different generator requests on the grid. And so SPP's initiated, hundreds of millions of dollars of transmission expansion in the past to kind of unlock grid capacity, support reliability, mitigate congestion in the wholesale market. But depending on the amount of generator requests that are going to move forward, it's kind of hard to move forward on a plan like that until you have more surety on, are the generators going to move forward as well. And so it gets into this huge cost allocation battle of, does load pay for all these, or do the generator connectors pay for all of it? And I think there's a ton of debate and discussion going on right now in SPP on what's the best way to move forward. But I think we all can agree larger transmission build out across the region is going to support more load. It's going to support more bulk generation. It'll free up capacity. It'll unlock some of these backlog queues. But unfortunately, building huge transmission takes many years to build. Sometimes takes longer to build than building power plants themselves. So still a lot to work through, but that is a huge debate going on in the SPP region right now.
Okay. I'm good for now. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Let's keep going forward, and if we need to come back, we can. I think this slide has got a lot of good information. Maybe we can revisit it in a little bit after we get through some more of the next steps.
Okay. So I think this next section, we get into the external communications and customer feedback efforts that were launched since the June board committee meeting. And I think with this, I'm going to turn it over to Kate Thomas in our public affairs group.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate that. And we just have a few summary slides that we'll go through here that will provide a little bit more color into our communication outreach approach during this time. So just to ground ourselves, when we thought about the communication outreach needed for this effort, we knew that educating employees, customers, stakeholders about the complexity of the issues this recommendation was solving for would be critical. We use the INFORM approach from the International Association of Public Participation, or IAP2 model that we've been using for a few years now to guide our efforts. And so what that meant was that our focus would be building awareness and understanding among employees, customers, and stakeholders why we are making this recommendation. So making sure that you're crisp on messaging about why it was needed and what our approach has been to get to this point was key. And we used a number of tactics to get there. Our efforts began, if you look on the right side of the slide, with our employees around the June committee meeting where this recommendation was announced. And then we engaged our customers and stakeholders throughout the June, July, and August period up to this point. Because keeping both our employees and our customers and stakeholders informed along the way was a priority. So next slide, please. So externally, we used a variety of tactics and channels to inform and educate. Following the recommendation that was made in June, nearly immediately after, we published a story on our brand journalism site, OPPD The Wire, which was shared on social media to the public and which we saw traditional media either share, retweet, or use as a basis for their own media coverage. And you can see what some of these views and visitors look like. We were pleased that the average time on our post was 6 minutes and 7 seconds. That's far above many benchmarks you see where it's around 2 to 3 minutes even for an involved post. So for those who did visit, we saw that they were spending time understanding, or at least seeking to understand. We also saw more than 20 individual stories from local and regional news outlets, including the World Herald and our larger local TV network affiliates throughout this June through August period. You may have seen some of that yourself, even over the last couple of weeks. And we've been really grateful that the media has helped us raise awareness and understanding by just amplifying that message. How important it was, and we love that they pulled on our content and then also helped to amplify it. We made the information available on OPPD.com on a unique page and on OPPD Community Connect. And within that page, we included a video from Mr. Fernandez explaining that, and then also a downloadable explainer PDF so that people could take that with them, trying to hit kind of as many different learning channels as possible. We also featured the recommendation in our monthly bill insert newsletter outlet. All customers receive this newsletter, so even if they're not online or connected to media or watching the news, they had an opportunity to see it in paper form. And then for our paperless employees, outlets is also provided digitally via email. So in addition to those broad channels, we also use in-person conversation and personal outreach through calls and emails, which included touch points with regulators, city officials, state senators, and community groups like Sierra Club and Citizens Climate Lobby. We also were present and available to talk about this recommendation at events during this period, so the Omaha Festival and Juneteenth Parade, so that we were reaching many different audiences. And in sum, what we found is that while not all liked the recommendation, they did understand the rationale behind it, which was our aim. We understood there was a number of complex factors leading us to this recommendation. Also, anecdotally, we heard that our thoughtfulness on reliability and keeping the power flowing was acknowledged. And some even asked if it might impact our longer range 2050 net zero goal. And we were really happy to reinforce that this recommendation would not impact that goal. That seemed to helped quite a bit in several of these conversations.
Hey,
We
Kate,
also
this is
heavily
Lisa.
appreciate.
Sorry for the interruption. I also wanted to just take a moment here. Of all of the outreach that we have done over the past several years, as long as I've been here, this is one that took a very coordinated effort across all of the business units, especially between customer service and the regulators, and especially with Michaela Valentine and Seth Boyles reaching out to city council members, to Douglas County commissioners, to the mayor. We had a meeting with the Tom Warren, the chief of staff, because as you know, this is a complex situation. And with stakeholder, they understood why. And they said that they would reach out to us if they received any other questions and so forth. And so we made ourselves available for that. We also sent follow-up emails to all of the elected officials, including state senators, especially all the Omaha state senators. And then as we were out in the community, as you said, Kate, we were able to have conversations to say, did you get the information? Do you have any questions? Is there anybody else that you think that we should meet with? At the Juneteenth parade and the Omaha Freedom Festival, we had a booth there for the entire weekend so that people could ask questions on energy efficiency or what was going on in the community. So this was not a one and done. It's going to continue as well. And I'm so proud of the teams. And Javier had intense conversations with the chambers, and we're part of the North Omaha Business Park planning with Senator Wayne and Senator McKinney on, LB 1024. So we have multiple times that we get to have conversations if they have questions. So I just want to take that moment that this was a full court press, and how we will continue those conversations, especially through the extension, to let the community know what's happening and next steps. So thank you for that pause there, Kate.
No, that was wonderful detail. So thank you for providing that. And I think really helps just provide more color commentary into what those conversations have looked like.
If I may, real quick too, just to emphasize what Lisa just said, I personally had a few conversations with the governor about these. Just as early as last week, had phone conversations with other elected officials like Councilwoman Johnson and others. So we've been, again, as Lisa said, very active trying to share this information. And we understand sometimes this is dense information and not every elected official has responded in the same way, but I am very proud of the outreach that the team has had. We've had about 60 days from the June committee meeting until today, and the work has not stopped. And I want to make sure that I touch on something that I know Director Williams or others may talk about later on, which is the engagement will not stop after Thursday. Right, the engagement continues. This is part of our commitment. This is one of the ways that we have to live out our core values, to honor our community, having a passion to serve and caring for others. We will continue that outreach throughout the conversion, throughout the delay of the plant, throughout the bringing up the new assets. This outreach doesn't stop, but we do want to make sure that the public understands we have had significant outreach in the past 60 days, trying to letting elected officials and other leaders understand what is it that we're doing. I have actually answered questions that are a little off. People are asking me, "Hey, are you going to convert the first 3 units into coal again?" I'm like, no, absolutely not. Right? It has been a great opportunity to dispel myths or misinformation that's been floating around and really explain what this is. Why are we proposing what we're proposing, and what are the consequences? So very proud of the outreach efforts done by Lisa and her team.
And Javier, I just want to take a moment also. The board members have been highly engaged in this, and their outreach with Director Williams and Director Moody and Director Bogner, and I could mention them all. So they're out in the communities as well. So we greatly appreciate the efforts that they did as well. So. So Kate, back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you were just getting where I was getting. That was so helpful that our board members also engage in these direct conversations. So we appreciate that. We can move on to the next slide, which is a little bit more color commentary into just some of our observations from social media. I won't go into all of this, but it does just show the depth of kind of what we had posted on social media, including Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. And at the top, I'll just kind of read you through this, is that, we posted 14 times organically on our accounts, right? So just organically through our accounts, we've reached about 11,900 people. Our impressions were around 24,800. So reach is people, impressions would be opportunities for a pair of eyes to see that content, right? So a person could see it more than once. We saw, over a couple hundred links. Engagements nearing 800, so that's anytime someone comments or posts or likes or just has a reaction in any way. But it also shows you this next piece, the power of sharing, and when we are able to get others to share our content, what that does. So we had 33 shares of our posts, our organic posts by others. That includes media outlets. And what that led to, if you look just right below, is yes, we got additional mentions, right, in kind of the social media conversation. But then our impressions and our reach really skyrocketed, right? So reaching 363,000 people as opposed to the 12,000 that we would have reached only on our own. And then 1.7 million total impressions or opportunities for people to see it. So we were pleased by that, pleased that the community was sharing this, and that the outlets and voices who had some reach were sharing information. I think what's also interesting is if you look over here on the right, it's a small pie chart of sentiment volume. So we are able to use a tool that is powered by AI, and what it does is it scans all of the kind of topics related to these posts or the conversation around this topic, specifically OPPD's North Omaha Station recommendation. And it analyzes language and engagement and kind of assigns sentiment to it. And so it's not perfect, but it is an interesting thing to note that 83% of all of the coverage that we saw had a neutral sentiment. So either an outlet wrote about it in a neutral way, or the reactions were somewhat neutral, or comments were somewhat neutral, and then about 6% were positive. So again, not necessarily representative of all of the conversations that we have in our outreach, but something that's, I think, good to note as we think about the impact on social media. Okay, next slide, please. And then finally, we kept track of our official board contacts and our live stream traffic. We saw more than 60 board contacts. In fact, I think 15 or so came through last night from across our service area, from most of our districts. And around 50 customers attended June's board meeting via live stream. And we'll do the analysis here on this August call, but probably roughly about the same. Each week, throughout this June to August period, we did send our board of directors weekly updates that had a full summary of any board contacts that were received, media coverage, and then social media commentary, just so that all of our board members were really apprised of the conversation that was happening around the recommendation, if it was evolving or if there were themes that were emerging. So in sum, we feel good about our efforts to raise awareness and understanding. Anecdotally, we feel like we hit the mark in terms of people understanding the rationale behind the recommendation. Whether or not they agree on it, we felt like we were headed in the right direction. So that's what we have, and concludes our summary of communication and outreach efforts. And thank you for the opportunity to share. I'll pause.
Great, thanks very much. Appreciate that that highlight. Question from Director Yoder, it looks like.
Thank you very much. Appreciate all the numbers that you've got. So I'm struck a little bit by my read. Of course, I wasn't involved in 2014, But my read of the resolution 6006 that initially set out the energy plan along with demand side management, that wasn't it had a couple of whereas clauses that spoke about open houses and a comprehensive customer research initiative. Whereas this activity for this year is an inform only, right? So I guess what to me, it's about asking the right questions, maybe, or how you approach. What's the approach to engagement there? So clearly, IAP2 is just to inform. Your power's on, your power's off. This is what we're going to do. Inform. But in developing the generation plan back in 2014, from what I can tell from the resolution and talking with some community members who were engaged back then, it was a deeper discussion, and I'm curious about the compare and contrast there. And really, what I'd like to get out of this is, how did we gauge any kind of residential sentiment on the impact of this decision on them and their neighborhoods? That's where my kind of two questions are.
Well, Director Yoder, I appreciate that context. As you know from our stakeholder, we have evolved from those earlier days, and especially with IAP2. And we made the recommendation to executive leadership team, the team did, as well as to the board, that we would enter this phase as informed due to options that we had. Whereas in the past, there were more options of where we were looking at decision points in that regard. So the engagement was different, and it was chosen by design for this one due to that that narrative.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would add is if I could recall the collective mind back to 2019, and we talked about this originally, and I think Lisa intimated to it, but the demand on the utility limited the number of options that could be used to restore reliability and keep bills low. And so when we had that power with purpose conversation, we talked about the truths behind that and why we were viewing it the way we were and the way we are, in order to make sure that folks could understand what was going on and why it was happening and the obligations that we had to satisfy. And so I heard the 2014 analogy, Director Yoder, and I hear today, but I didn't hear a nod to the conversations that we had in 2019 when we set this plan in motion, and now the plan is still good. It's temporarily challenged by some of these regulatory processes that are much discussed, but I hope that is also helpful in some regard.
Yeah. So 2014 had one plan in mind, and 2019 had another plan in mind to make 2014 happen. What I'm really trying to get to is, I think we had a sense from the community of their desire to reduce emissions. I mean, to respond to the impacts that they had. That didn't change in 2019. I mean, we still said in 2019 that the closure will happen. So to your point, that's my response. So I'm really curious as to how your team, Lisa, and sought to understand the impact of continued operations on the communities that were engaged to first say, hey, let's get this shuttered in 2023.
Director Yoder, recognizing that question was to Ms. Olson, I would just offer a quick bit of context, if it's okay. That sentiment that you articulated around ceasing coal generation at North Omaha is being reacted to. And the best way to reduce those emissions is to bring on other assets that maintain our reliability and allow us to have an 80% reduction in emissions at the station, which I believe and I hope would be recalled to your memory from the 2019 evolution. And so when we think about the system, I would counsel that the system is dynamic. The system is confined to regulatory processes and to specific assets with specific attributes. And we continually try and align those to customer expectations, both from an affordability, a reliability, and an environmentally sensitive perspective. And so that work continues. But I guess I just want to be clear from a technical perspective, there's no change to what we're trying to accomplish here. You know, especially it's a significant decision, but when you look back on the organization and its history, it is a temporal pause on something that we're trying to get done in pursuit of our long-term goal. So I'm sorry, Ms. Olson, for interrupting there.
No, I appreciate that. We have talked to many about how this isn't if, it's just when. And so it's the change of the timeline and it's around the reliability aspect of it. So once again, I'll say it from a stakeholder standpoint, people may not like the answer, but they'll understand the why.
I'm going to withdraw from back and forth at this point and allow others to speak.
Great. Director Moody.
Yeah, I'll excuse me, I'll chime in just real quick here. I understand why we made the decision to pursue an informed pathway on the IAP too, because this is really, at its core, it's a technical question, and which has a technical answer at its core. But I think over the last 2 months, part of what I've realized in talking to people and attending town halls, and Eric did a really great town hall that answered a lot of questions. Constituencies understand the technical nature of it when we have the time and opportunity to talk with them about it, but they still have questions that sort of sit outside of that they are interested in. And, you know, the connection to our net zero pathway plan for 2050 and the implications on the community from an environmental assessment standpoint. So like I said, while I understand that when you look at the core of it, why we made that decision, I think the reality is my experience was there was a lot more that needed to be explored when it came to engaging with our constituencies, customer owners, in particular those that live in North Omaha. So, and to your point, Lisa, I really hope, and I'll say that I, as a board member, expect that this is going to continue.
Yes.
That those conversations are going to, that maybe are going to hasten, and that's something for us to talk about later, perhaps. But I just wanted to share my perspective of kind of what the experience was, quote unquote, in the field, so to speak.
I appreciate that. And you are spot on. In fact, the team's brainstorming right now of continuation and even ramping it up even more over this journey, so we keep people updated of exactly what's happening with emissions, what's happening in the community.
Yeah,
we're also very fortunate because we have over 100 employees that live in the North Omaha area as well. That's why we make sure that they're in the know so that they can communicate to their neighbors as well.
So following on Craig's point, I think the process by which we select the IAP2 level for engagement is something I'd like to discuss in the future. I understand the mechanism chosen here with a level 1 for inform related to the technical components, as Director Moody said. I also experienced functionally every conversation I had, people understood the scenario we are in, option 1, option 2, and the outcome of what we need to do to maintain the reliability for people in our service territory. The additional component that I feel needs to have additional discussion is there can be no denying that this extension will lead to additional emissions from North Omaha Station, specifically in one part of the community. And the engagement around the way in which we recognize those additional emissions as a change from the behavior that we had previously outlined, that the board had previously approved, and the way we communicate that to the community, and the way we engage with the community in assessing what those outcomes are and taking action to mitigate the consequences of those additional emissions. That's the part where I feel a higher level of IAP2 public engagement would be appropriate. And there was a slide earlier that highlighted some of the steps moving forward that are not specifically related to the technical decision about meeting our capacity requirements for SPP, but the slide highlighted how we will engage with the community. And I want to make sure that we have sufficient discussion about what exactly will that look like. What are we saying proactively prior to an approval of this item, so that the community members who are most interested and those who have submitted comments and chosen to be engaged can understand what specifically will we do to both recognize the increased emissions that will come from this decision and work toward mitigation of the consequences of the decision that we're asked to make. And that's the part where increased engagement would be beneficial. And that's where I spend most of my time on the discussion with the people I represent in Subdivision 6 who live closest to North Omaha Station, because that's what they are really most interested in. They understand the technical components. They do not feel that sufficient engagement around what are we going to do to do right by our community. They do not feel that that was sufficiently addressed. And so, as I said, there is a bullet point listed on one of the slides earlier that I flagged and wanted to make sure we return to. And I do think that that is something that we should make sure and fully explore as a part of the resolution that we are considering for Thursday.
Director Williams, thank you for chiming in on that. And well, Director Moody said that he lost audio. I hope you can still hear me. Okay, so let's text Director Moody saying he's the only one.
Director Moody, you're currently muted. I'll send you an unmute request.
So back to Director Williams, the comment you made about community engagement, I think that is incredibly important. And as I said earlier, our community engagement does not stop here. In fact, this would mark a milestone for us to do more of that community engagement. And that includes, as Director Yoder alluded to, what are the consequences of us continuing the North Omaha operations in its current state for about 3 more years? Positive and negative consequences. We mentioned emissions earlier on in the conversation. Director Yoder talked about, is it only CO2 emissions? No, it's all greenhouse gas emissions. What does that mean, not only for the residents in North Omaha, but for the community at large? And at the same time, also talk about what does this mean in terms of keeping the lights on? What does this mean in terms of keeping reliability on for those people who have dialysis machines and oxygen machines at home, who can live comfortably and sustain life at home, knowing that they can rely on the power we serve? For those hospitals, water treatment facilities, sewage treatment facilities, public safety, etc., who rely on the power that we provide. So we really clearly need to do more engagement, and we will continue to do this. And this, again, the resolution and the vote does not stop our engagement. We will continue to do that to better understand how can we act as a catalyst of change, as an agent of change in those communities, fully acknowledging that it takes many to make this change, right? OPPD on its own, there are certain things that statutorily we cannot do. However, we can partner with other organizations, housing organizations and public health organizations, research organizations that we commit to engaging with and coming back with action items, recommendations for our board or perhaps other boards, depending on who engages, on how can we continue to better our communities, improve our communities. So great point, Director Williams. And Now, this is something that again, it's at the core of who we are. It's part of our core values. This conversation, this decision is helping us surface that again and continue to double down on that commitment to engage with the community. And rest assured, I think this is something that we're discussing internally. It should be reflected on the resolution that will be presented to the board on Thursday.
CEO Fernandez, I appreciate that specific point there about reflecting the continued engagement with the community in the resolution by Thursday. That's something that's very important to me and the people that I represent in North Omaha. I think that it's not possible for anyone to frame it more clearly than one of the attendees at my town hall, who pointed out that option one, if we proactively decommission North Omaha Station and leave ourselves without the needed reliability, his father might be without medical oxygen. But option two, the continued operation and by extension, the continued emissions, means that the air for his son might not be the type of the air quality that he would want for his son to grow up in a fully healthy environment. And so I think it's important that we remember that the technical components of operating the grid to meet the mission of our organization are critical. And as we make this decision, what are we going to do to proactively let people in our community know here is how we will respond to the concerns under option two for the recommended extension to address the emissions that will come from this. And again, including that in the resolution is critical to me, and I appreciate you mentioning that. And I look forward to making sure that we have the right language in the resolution to clarify the ongoing engagement that we will have with the community, specifically related to identifying environmental impacts and developing an action plan for how we will address those moving forward. Director Moody, do you have an additional comment?
If I may just quickly here, and maybe this is a little reporting on something I reported in June, I'm going to talk about the new executive position that I am recruiting at OPPD. We are recruiting for a new vice president of sustainability and environmental affairs. It's a position that we've never had at OPPD. The position closed at the end of July. We're in the middle of reviewing resumes and we will start interviews here soon. I fully expect this type of engagement to be one of the first projects that this person will take on. And clearly in partnership with Lisa's team on the public affairs and stakeholder engagement, it's one that will benefit greatly from these organizational change that we're making. So I'm just connecting a few other dots that will, in my mind, that's how we're going to be able to drive these home and make an even bigger impact.
I'll hop in sound check. I had to switch audio. Am I good? All right. Two things. I wanted to reinforce what Eric just described in terms of having this in the resolution. I think that's extraordinarily important and really sends an important signal where the board can speak as a unit about its expectations and desires for what's going to come forward. So I think that's really good. And I also want to double down on, I think, something that perhaps both Javier and Eric said, which is this is a community effort. This is not something that we are just going to own as a utility. The environmental impacts, we certainly should own those, and we should think about what we can do. But there are so many other layers that the North Omaha community in particular is susceptible to. So we need to we can play a pretty amazing role as a catalyst for something that could be really important and special. And so I'm looking forward to whatever that looks like.
Great. Thank you. And I guess, yep, sorry, Director Howard.
I haven't weighed in on a lot of this because I've wanted to listen to everybody's thoughts about some of these changes. And I've expressed this concern to Mr. Underwood, and that is in the resolution itself, I don't see a timeline, not even for completion, but for us to revisit the issue as a board. I know there's the intention that we would have these consistent, we would get consistent feedback on how things are going. But for me, I would have a lot more comfort if there was some sort of deadline, if there was some sort of action plan, if it was clear that, in 2 years, we would sort of force the issue and make sure that we as a board had our eyes on it again. That's the sort of thing that we did a lot in my old job. We would put sunsets on things so that we would have to revisit it. And I think when I look at the resolution, I understand why, folks don't want a timeline. But just from where I'm coming from, this is something where we need to keep our eyes on it in a more aggressive way. I think of it from a health perspective. What I'm hearing from my constituents, and my district is directly south of Director Williams' district. I'm hearing it from a health perspective around our shared constituents. And so I want to make sure that I honor what they're telling me to do, which is to get some of those clarifications around mitigating those health impacts and also get a clearer timeline of when we as a board will revisit this. I'm not even asking you to know when the work would be complete, but when will the board have a date certain that we would be revisiting it? And right now I don't see that in the resolution as written. And so that's what I'm struggling with as we have this conversation. And I just wanted to be very candid about that.
So I'll note that there is a little bit of content left, but not wanting to be dismissive of the question by any means. What we're talking about now is you may recall the Power with Purpose monthly updates. We bring updates monthly around the project, and we've tried to do a better job of talking about the upgrades as a whole and the complexity around them, because all of this is tied together. So some of that discussion has led to a monthly update on the interconnection. And so what my suspicion would be is that as part of our monthly updates on Power with Purpose, we talk about the status of the interconnection. So we have that data point. We also have a data point that is moving more than I would like. But as it relates to getting the GIA results back, we have that at the end of 2024 or early 2025. And then based on that data point, we will have the highest level of resolution on what will be required and how long it will take. And that's when we really start kind of channeling that milestone thing. So, as far as customer feedback goes, and I think Director Williams maybe or somebody said it where they said, hey, they understand what you're doing and why you have to do it, but they're disappointed that you didn't do what you said you were going to do when you said you were going to do it. And I am reticent that if we put a date on this, that we will miss it. We may be earlier, we may be a little bit later, but it's worth noting that that is real, that we can't control that. And so in light of that, what are the frequency of updates that we'll give to the board? And we're moving around monthly at this point. So there may be more thoughts, but that would be my reaction.
So Brad, thank you for that. And Director Howard, I fully understand where you're coming from. And yeah, if it were me, I would like more certainty. The reason why, as Brad correctly pointed out here, it's to have that flexibility, right? Reputation is incredibly important, and we are already telling the public we need to amend the plan. We may have to amend the plan again if, for whatever reason, the interconnection approval process takes a little longer than we were anticipating already, and this moves us into Q1 of 2027. We would have then to mobilize a very large group of OPPD employees to get yet another resolution on to extend these a little bit more, if that were the case. I can tell you today that I have mobilized already a very large portion of the organization who have been working for the past 4 months on nothing other than this decision. Very important decision. Stakeholder outreach, technical preparation, presentations, debriefs with the board, and all of it. That's fantastic, and I do not regret any of that. Having to do that again, if the delay goes past December of 2026, and let's say it's Q1 of 2027, having to mobilize all of that again, it is a concern. Now we can certainly put that on, and it would be up, it's the board's prerogative. But that's the reason why we're very clearly stating that our intention and our expectation is that by the end of 2026, we should have this plan completed. We should have all of the changes in the North Omaha station completed by then. That is because we are expecting a generation interconnection, final generation interconnection sometime in 2025. We are also expecting that SPP will not tell us that there is more infrastructure that needs to be installed. But those things could change, right? And so that is one of the reasons why we would like to retain that flexibility, while still letting the board and the public know that our intention, our plan is for this conversion to take place by no later than the end of 2026. But of course, that this is a board decision, and it's your prerogative of how you want to move forward. And those of you who will likely be here in 2 years, who would have to then help us sort this out and vote again, right?
So we've talked about the potential to include a timeline for the completion of the conversion in the past. And I understand the technical reasons why that would be extremely complicated. In the Systems Committee, we have talked about an adjacent policy that would be closely related here. Specifically under Strategic Directive 7, we have been working toward an update for interim metrics on carbon emissions reduction. And so from the original flyer that was handed out in 2019, we highlighted that the conversion and removal of coal from North Omaha Station would lead to something like a 90%, I think I heard someone say earlier today, 80% reduction of carbon emissions from that facility. If we look toward the entire fleet, something like 30% overall. So I might suggest that instead of looking at a timeline specifically in the resolution, we can find an adjacent policy update that matches the expected completion of the North Omaha Station conversion by the end of 2026, that has accountability from the staff to the board to the public through an interim metric of carbon emissions reduction in line with that completion at the end of 2026. This is something we have talked about in the Systems Committee, and I'm not sure if Brad or Javier, if you would like to respond about the Systems Committee bringing forward that policy update as another mechanism instead of specifically a date included in the resolution related to North Omaha Station extension.
That is an excellent point, Director Williams, and one that solution would provide the flexibility to staff that we are seeking in this resolution for the North Omaha extension, and the accountability for us to make those changes. There is no other way that we could reduce emissions by 30% system-wide, or 80 or 90% at the North Omaha Station, unless we cease coal operations of units 4 and 5. So these would, again, close down that loop of accountability for us to make sure that the conversion takes place in the 2026 timeframe, so that we can achieve that milestone, that interim metric in 2027. I think that would be a solution that would provide the accountability that Director Howard is maybe some of the accountability that Director Howard is looking for, and the flexibility that staff is looking for too.
Director Moody, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, that strikes me as an interesting solution that could work. I guess it in a scenario where it's going to happen, let's just say on January 30th of 2027 rather than December 31st, it at least allows us that flexibility to allow that to happen and not go through this process again. Ultimately, the measure of accountability here is the monitoring report of that strategic directive, right? So that's what we would get to. I think for the public's, from their perspective, one way or another, we're going to communicate the heck out of this. We're going to tell them where we're at, what's coming, what's next, where we're at in the process, and then certainly as we get, if we're starting to sniff that date and get close to it, that's something that we're gonna make sure that we talk publicly, because the last thing we want is for anyone to think that we're just trying to sneak this in the back door because we're using a strategic directive as accountability. This will be a topic we'll talk about a lot leading up to those dates. I think that could work.
Great. I appreciate the follow-up there, Director Moody. I don't see any other hands here, but from the discussion we've just had, moving forward, I would anticipate the Systems Committee would be prepared to discuss that specific policy update during our September meeting and bring forward a recommended language update in line with that. There would be some flexibility around the specific month of completion, and I think that the annual CO2 emissions reduction metric would allow that to be a little bit more compatible with the timeline that's been expressed here. If it is Q1 2027, I think we would understand that while still providing the accountability that we've talked about for successfully completing this this conversion on the timeline that we anticipate. So I guess on that specific note, I don't see other hands or hear other directors right now. I want to make sure that we resolve that part specifically for steps moving forward. Director Molhoff, I do see your hand now.
Yeah, so I think that's a good plan. I think that's a good way to hold ourselves and the organization accountable. I just want to speak to for a minute about what it means if we delay this decision, because we know from the report we got today, we know that our 2 gas plants won't even be ready until 2024, which misses the deadline. And so we already know that we've missed that mark. We have to think about our employees, our ability to meet reliability, and future outreach to the North Omaha community that helps them to be involved with this, with the mitigation procedures. And we can do that all at the same time with this resolution. And I guess my concern is back in 2019, when we were talking about power with purpose, and we kept delaying the decision because we wanted to do more community outreach, and we wanted to, bring more people into the discussion, and we wanted to make sure everybody was on board with it. Well, then here we are. Those delays in decision making, I think, doesn't help the organization, and it doesn't help us as directors to make sure that we're leading and not trying to push this down the road. So I just feel like I need to kind of say that, because delaying a decision on this resolution puts us closer to, we only have a few months until it's already 2023. And so the organization really needs a chance to respond, to plan, to change their operations, to make sure we have employees on board. And so I think it's just really kind of dangerous to continue to push this to another month, because the outreach will happen, whether we make that decision this month or next month. The outreach will happen, and I think that it's important to move forward with making this decision.
Yeah, I appreciate the wisdom in your comments, Director Molhoff, and there would be significant compression on various aspects of the organization, specifically utility operations. And with that compression comes more risk. And I'd ask Scott Edom to really talk about what this does to the utility operations business and what it means and the implications of a delay, which are significant.
Yeah, Brad, Director Molhoff, I would agree with Mr. Underwood. You have very good points. And I'll offer some very specific as well as some high level thoughts on what those.
Scott, would you mind introducing yourself just for the benefit of the public?
Yes. Again, Scott Edom, Director of Engineering Services and Utility Operations. So again, if we would delay the decision, that organizational clarity is really needed for proper planning and deliberate execution for the safe preparation and execution of our outages, which again, by definition, they are periods where we maintain and repair the plants to ensure reliable and efficient operation. As Javier alluded to, we need to establish and maintain our sufficient staffing levels to run North Omaha and those related workflows. So again, if we do delay, it can further compact those processes. You know, the maintenance and refueling outages they're not optional. They're required to perform the preventive maintenance and repairs to ensure reliable operation through the cycle. We have done preliminary work, as Javier stated, over the last several months. We've done an extensive review, but there is a lot of work that remains to be completed. Again, to ensure that the generating units at North Omaha are ready to perform and safely and reliably operate to perform their main function, which is not only the generation of electricity, but grid support. So some of those specific details that I think can be challenged, and again, this is just to provide that information to the board so you understand just what type of massive undertaking that utility ops and the rest of the organization goes through to pull off these outages in the spring and the fall, which is when we normally plan for them. So in general, we have a 5-year multidisciplinary internal outage planning process in which the entire fleet, we review and balance the market, grid reliability, and outage resource needs, as well as the projects that need to be completed. And we have to get advance approval from SPP for those planned outage windows. As the regional transmission operator, they have to evaluate all of the generation outage requests in the footprint in order to ensure that the reliability isn't impacted. Delaying the decision can impact OPPD and other utilities' ability to perform those needed outages due to the inaccuracy of the model with requests that are already submitted to date. From an internal utility ops perspective, we have an 18-month outage planning process for individual units, as well as the entire generation fleet holistically, that could be compacted even further if delayed. As part of this review effort, we are trying to bring the needed outage for Unit 4 to perform some of that essential maintenance to ensure reliable operation into the fall of 2023. So we've already compacted the 18, 17, and 16-month milestones for that outage planning even now. That can challenge our safe and efficient and cost-effective outage completion for that unit and the fleet. If we talk about the fleet for 2023 alone, for the base load units, there's approximately 3,800 work hours. So again, these are estimated numbers. All the planning is not done, but approximately 3,800 work order tasks that are expected to be needed to support the 2023 outages alone. Again, we look at a 5-year swath with approximately 2,700 of those tasks being completed by internal craft maintenance personnel, equating to over 70,000 person hours based upon past similar scope. So we still need to plan these, schedule them, and apply resources to this work. So in addition to our internal personnel that do a majority of the outage work, we also expect approximately 95 contractors are expected to support, again, the fleet and their outages that year, for a total of 600 supplemental personnels being assigned to the sites. So these delays can challenge that procurement of outside resources and materials to successfully complete those outage tasks. Now, Javier did talk about the North Omaha staffing, the critical personnel operations specifically. There's interdependencies between Turtle Creek and Standing Bear staffing as well as North Omaha. I would state that the city of Omaha requires a stationary engineer's license only for North Omaha stations. So of all the generating fleets, that is the stations in the fleet, that's the only one that has that requirement on it. And that's a combination of certification experience of 3 to 5 years for North Omaha. So I can't easily transfer operations from Nebraska City up to North Omaha to run it. So those are just some of the details, and I did go very deep just so that you fully understood that this planning has to be completed now so that we can be successful. And it is enterprise-wide, but there is a huge utility ops focus for the completion. And again, the entire reason why we do the outages are to ensure that the units can perform their reliability function when called upon. So again, thank you, Director Molhoff. I appreciate the ability to provide some of those details.
Director Moody.
Sure. I'll be quick. Janice, thank you for bringing that up. And Scott, thanks for the deep dive on that. That's really helpful to wrap our head around, or my arms around, kind of the nature of the work that's in front of us. We're certainly, as board members, getting inquiries from the public about delaying the vote. Undeniably, that's something that they're asking for right now. And I'll say a few things about that. One is I've been out causing trouble enough in this community to have attended many a public meeting, and nothing is more infuriating than check the box public meetings. So when I think about delaying the vote, the reality is that the technical nature of this, as we talked about earlier, is pretty cut and dry. What's worth exploring, in my opinion, is the mitigation work that we talked about earlier. So to me, I think that what our goal should be as board members is to be responsive to what we're hearing from the public. And in my view, the responsiveness here is thinking about how do we take the cards that we've been dealt and leverage it so that we can do something meaningful. And really, I hope that we get the resolution right to articulate what our plans are, and then pivot our engagement work to be really focused on that rather than revisiting the technical part of this over and over and over again, which again is not going to change in the next 4 weeks.
Thank you. I saw Director Yoder, but then he went away.
Oh, well, because I anticipated you were going to call on me. I just wanted to echo what Director Moody had to say there. In the planning that's gone into this, the technical requirement, absolutely, I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I don't, you know, these are plans that were probably first thought of back in 2014, eight years ago, with Resolution 6006, and probably thought of again in 2016, 6 years ago, when those goals for North Omaha Station were revised slightly, but still in place. And again in 2019, as Mr. Underwood said, 3 years ago. So I think where we're headed technically is pretty clear. To not postpone it another month, I think requires we board members to respond to what we're hearing from the constituents, to talk about the social impact that the additional 3 years will have, and to identify at a fairly clearly, at a high level, what kind of mitigation is going to take place. So that's it, quickly.
I'm going to ask CEO Fernandez to respond to that one.
He may not be there.
Oh,
I am here. I'm just getting my microphone ready.
Apologies. Thank you.
So thank you, Director Yoder. Yes, and we will, as I mentioned to Director Williams earlier, we will include that in the resolution. I think it's premature and preliminary for us to lay out exactly what type of mitigation items we will find. I think it's presumptuous of us to think that in the next couple of days we will come up with a suite of mitigation actions. What the commitment is that we will engage with the public, we will engage with other organizations, as I mentioned earlier, organizations that have the expertise that we don't have on housing, public health, public housing, research, education organizations, universities, etc., where we can join forces and come up with ideas. When you talked about the consequences of this extension, it'll be very, very important for us to consider all the consequences, not only the negative consequences of continuing to emit greenhouse gas emissions, but also the positive consequences of leaving those oxygen machines on, those dialysis machines on. That reliability, that access to public drinking water, sewage treatment facilities, etc. So it involves a much larger effort, and that is what we are. I am committing to doing that here in public at the committee meeting, and it will be reflected in the resolution.
Okay, I appreciate the input from other directors there and the response from CEO Fernandez about how we will outline environmental impact assessment and action plan. We had wanted to try and conclude the presentation and then wrap with discussion. We have spent some time on discussion here now. Looking at the agenda and what we had outlined, it's been quite a while. Chair Bogner, would you like to take a break here for a bit and come back and then conclude this item?
Yes, please. I think that everyone could use a leg stretch right now. So let's break for about 10 minutes. I'll see you back at 2:45, and we will conclude the slides and our discussion on this topic before moving to the next agenda item. Thank you. All right, let's get started again. Director Williams, I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thanks very much. We do have some additional slides I want to make sure we get to. So response to customer feedback, I'm not sure who's talking about this portion, but whoever it is, please jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Director Williams. It's I introduce myself again since it's been a while since I talked. But again, Dan Linehan, Director of System Planning. So I think I'm going to round out the last handful of slides in this presentation here. And so where I'm going to start here is after we just got done talking about some of the feedback stats that we got from our customers, and wanted to address some of that feedback, notably questions regarding our commitment to environmental sensitive energy. And so first, I wanted to start by showing what OPPD has historically done to improve our environmentally sensitive energy position. So over the last decade, we made a commitment and concerted effort to significantly reduce our generating fleet emissions while maintaining reliability and affordability. Each of the graphs on the right are publicly posted on our website, and they show the different types of OPPD generating fleet emissions over the past decade, such as CO2, SO2, NOx, and mercury. And in each of these graphs, you'll note a material decline in those emission values, which demonstrates a proven ability for us to reduce these emissions while maintaining reliability and affordability. And so how have we done that? Well, over the past decade, we've added over 1,000 megawatts of new wind energy into our generation portfolio. We've converted 3 of our oldest coal units to natural gas, and we've introduced new demand-side management programs along the way. So going forward, OPPD will continue efforts to try and reduce emissions while adhering to the market rules and the system needs. And so I may just pause real quick to see if there's any comments from other staff on the slide before we go into the next one.
Well, I do just, I want to make sure that we we spend a little bit of time on these, because this is not easy. What you are seeing here, and this is for the benefit of the public, I know our board members have seen these graphs in the past. These are, by the way, posted on our OPPD.com website. This is a product of a lot of women and men dedicating their work lives to make this happen. I want to point out that, and again, I am not even suggesting that our work is done here. There's a lot more that we want to do. But I do want to note that if you can look at the graph on the upper left corner, annual CO2 emissions, compared to 2013, which was our peak when we had North Omaha 1, 2, and 3 operating on coal, compared to that year, if you compare that year to last year, OPPD has effectively reduced our carbon emissions by 4.2 million metric tons per year. Now you may wonder what does that mean? Well, 4.2 million metric tons per year is equivalent to the entire CO2 emissions for an entire year of every registered vehicle in our service territory. That is gigantic, and that does not happen by accident. Now, we still have a lot more to reduce, and this is part of what we're committed to seeing this conversion of North Omaha happen, to continue to see that decline. But I want to make sure that our customer owners realize that we have been hard at work, that we are not just beginning to improve our greenhouse gas emissions. We have already done that in the past 8 years, and our track record shows that. How we reduce that? Well, part of it was refueling the first 3 units in North Omaha, 1, 2, and 3, from coal to natural gas. Those units, as I report on a monthly basis in my president's report, they run seldomly, but they do run when we need them the most. Since then, we've also accumulated almost 1,000 megawatts of wind energy, as Mr. Lenihan talked about. So the results that you have in front of you are results that we are very proud of. It does not, again, I will repeat, it does not let us off the hook. There's a lot more that we want to do, but I want to reiterate to the public and to our stakeholders that our track record precedes us. That it may not feel that way with the resolution that we're asking our board to consider on Thursday, but that we are, I believe, and I stand by these, one of the most environmentally sensitive utilities in the state of Nebraska. We have been leading the way, and we will continue to lead the way while we maintain reliability and affordability. So thank you, Dan, for the opportunity to chime in on this. It's an incredibly important piece of our mission. It is a third leg of our stool in our mission to provide a reliable, affordable, and environmentally sensitive energy services to our customer owners.
Thanks, Javier. I think maybe a hand popped up before I can transition to where we're going forward. So I think Director Moody had a question.
Yep. I want to call back, I think, a question that Director Yoder asked about how we might alter our operations at North Omaha Station. It was something that we talked about. I think you presented to us in June that was something you were examining. So let's go back to that. I think this third bullet is kind of maybe the opportunity for us to explore a little bit further. Could you help us understand what some of the possibilities are, what that might look like? I know we got plenty of comments from the public again about all of the complexities associated with self-commit, market commit, et cetera, et cetera. So help us understand what the possibilities are related to that.
Sure. There may be some other folks who have perspectives, and I'll welcome them in, but as we have this conversation, we need to talk about the framework in which we operate. So many folks will remember Enron, and many folks will remember the intentional market manipulation that occurred within that organization, and ultimately the consequences to the structure in competitive power markets. There are specific things that generators have to do, whether they're load serving or merchant, when they offer in electricity. There's a framework so that you can't abuse the system. And so we want to make sure that's a low visibility item, but it is a significant and material item. The other thing that we want to talk about is the reliability benefits of the unit operating. So within those two frameworks, there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit that can be easily grasped, that we haven't already grasped, that would drive down emissions. But nonetheless, what we're trying to articulate here is that I'm going to call it the best fit profiles. The best fit profiles on the CO2, SO2, NOx, and mercury images on this line are reflective of the efforts that we've deployed within the context of the framework to reduce emissions over time, and there's no change to that. So as we continue to work on this, and it's embedded in our culture to do this, we'll bring back updates on things that we find, but we wanted to be authentic in our intention to do this, and also transparent that anything we've could get our hands on to reduce emissions, we've deployed. But we will continue to do that. There is no change to that, and we want to make sure that folks can hear that.
Thank you for that, Brad. If I could ask a follow-up question. We learned this morning about the new 2 natural gas facilities and the potential for an interim generation interconnect agreement. And again, let's not pretend that we know if and when that's going to happen, what it's going to look like. But if it did occur and we had that in hand to at least run those facilities sometime in 2024, would that create an opportunity for us to change the profile of how we run North Omaha these two units?
Yeah,
And I can answer that. I think the answer is yes, Director Moody. It would give us more flexibility.
Okay.
We would have more power coming from those two new stations. It will give us flexibility. Now, it is important very, very important to remind the public that these units, North Omaha 4 and 5, when they're running on coal units are not designed to be peaking units, right? So we cannot ramp them up and down, turn them on and off. Bad things happen mechanically to those units if you abuse them that way. However, that doesn't mean that we won't look into opportunities to run those units in a different way and offer them into the market in a different way. They have to be available at all times in order for them to be accredited. That's a key point here. However, there might be opportunities, especially in the shoulder months, where we know that there will be a lower load and the demand for capacity and energy may not be the same as in the peak months, for us to change the way in which we offer those units in the market, and that would help us then continue to reduce emissions in the interim. Back to Director Williams' point, we may not have to wait until 2027 to see any reductions. We may actually be able to do that in the interim. However, we don't know exactly how that's going to work. It will all depend on market conditions and system stability. But that condition that you presented, Director Moody, of having Turtle Creek Station and Standing Bear Lake Station on, would add a lot of flexibility for us to then look into how do we operate North Omaha 4 and 5 in a slightly different way.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Director Moody. I don't see any other hands raised, so I think we can go to the next slide. So I talked about what we've done in the past and our track record. So what are we doing going forward? So as many of you know, OPPD has a strategic directive to be net zero carbon by 2050. And that directive has not changed with the recommendation in front of you. And a temporary extension to North Omaha does not impact that end goal either. So OPPD recently completed our Pathways to Decarbonization Energy Portfolio study late last year in 2021. And these study results were incorporated into our most recently published Integrated Resource Plan, and both of which are posted on our website at oppdcommunityconnect.com. There were 8 key findings from that Pathways to Decarbonization study, which are listed on the screen here. And I wanted to just highlight a couple of those at the bottom of the list. So first, as we continue to rebalance our generation portfolio, we noted that there will be implementation and integration challenges with trying to accelerate that rebalancing. Particularly, we noted some of those challenges being related to supply chain and grid interconnection, which are 2 issues that are hitting us smack dab in the face on our Power with Purpose expansion plan and North Omaha transition plan right now. We also noted that the changing resource mix will pose new grid resiliency challenges that must be evaluated, understood, and mitigated prior to making major transitions of the generation fleet. So our goal of net zero carbon by 2050 remains, and we are confident we're going to overcome these challenges in meeting that goal, but we need to ensure we have proper runway to overcome them. If you transition to the next slide, I also wanted to talk about, as part of our net zero carbon goal for 2050, we recognize that demand side management, or DSM, plays a large role in decarbonization and mitigation of generation capacity needs. So this slide shows the evolution and growth of our DSM programs over the past few years. And there is a ton of information on this page just to illustrate all the work going on with this effort. And I'm not going to read through it all by any means, but wanted to at least provide that level of depth for those that are interested in reading through it all. So at a summary level, the table shows added human and financial resources each year. It also shows the steady growth in electric demand savings in megawatts. And it shows that we have product and service plans in place for the next few years to continue that emphasis. And with that, I think that rounds out the DSM topic, unless there wants to be some deeper dive questions on the programs, but maybe due to time, I'll continue on to the next slide here. I think we talked about this earlier, but we're going to obviously commit to providing periodic updates to the board and the public regarding this topic. Notably, status of milestones of these projects in the SPP generation interconnection process, along with the status of the projects in the interim interconnection process. And we also provide updates to the board and the public regarding any material interconnection policy or process change, which will impact how these gas assets get through the interconnection process. If you go to the next slide, which is the last one here. So this has been a very, very long agenda item and probably noteworthy to be so, but I know there's a ton of information presented today, a lot of it very technical. So just wanted to try and summarize the main points here on one slide. So that's what this is here. So, and those are the Power with Purpose Generation Expansion Project is the key enabler to fulfill the transition plan at North Omaha Station. It must occur in the right technical sequence at the right times in order to ensure grid reliability and resiliency is maintained to help avoid large-scale blackouts. While the direction of net zero carbon remains unchanged, as well as our intentions to refuel and retire the units at North Omaha Station, the timeliness of the generation changes is dependent upon variables not solely controlled by OPPD. Community feedback is they understand our commitment to reliability, but some are disappointed that we can't make the change when we said we would. Accordingly, social media sentiment says 89% is either neutral or positive regarding the recommendation. And additionally, in accordance with Powering the Future 2050, OPPD intends to engage with local education and community organizations to pursue efforts to improve overall impacts for the Omaha residents. As I mentioned before, updates will occur to the board publicly on a monthly frequency during the Power with Purpose project status meetings. The district will know more definitive timelines upon receipt of the generation interconnection study results published by our regional entity, the Southwest Power Pool, and that is estimated to get those results in late 2024 or early 2025, depending on how they progress to their backlog queue. Staff's recommendation is to extend North Omaha Station for a temporary period, just until we can get the Power with Purpose gas assets being completed and fulfilled all the regulated grid interconnection and delivery milestones, which are currently estimated now by the end of 2026. And so with that, I believe that concludes the presentation material, and we can open it up to additional questions now.
Director Bogner.
So I recognize that, you know, this is disappointing for many of us to, you know, this is not the direction we want to see, or these are the decisions we don't want to have to make when we made previous decisions that were in line with some of our strategic directives. I mean, we all recognize that this is a disappointing outcome. However, it's a temporary outcome. And so I just want to offer up that as we are thinking about this decision, I go back to some of our governance principles, and I just want to kind of call that out here publicly now and put that out into the ether here. So first off here is the board staff linkage 5. The board of directors operates under the principle of unity of control. And so this means that only decisions of the board acting as a whole are binding on the district. So I'll remind us of that. Second, individual directors may express their personal opinions on the proposed actions. In doing so, it's important to bear in mind that the board governance process number 7, or GP7, covering board member behavior, states that board members are expected to act in the best interest of OPPD and the customer owners. This supersedes any conflicting duties such as advocacy for a person, cause, or on behalf of interest groups. So it's definitely something that we all need to be keeping in mind here. And then third, as stated in GP7, each member of the board is expected to support the legitimacy and authority of the decisions of the board. This governance principle goes on to state a preference that board members refrain from criticism of board decisions. So even after Thursday, if we make a decision that's disappointing to many of us, we do need to honor that that decision is made and we move forward. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Director Williams, to continue this discussion.
Great. I appreciate that reminder about the governance and applicable principles and policies for the organization. We have had a good amount of discussion that was somewhat not the anticipated schedule, but that's what happened. I'm looking for additional hands or comments or input at this time about the information that's been presented, and with the understanding of a few of the connected or adjacent discussions that we've had so far today. Do any directors have additional follow-up questions for technical information and clarification? Or any additional, anything else you would like to express now? Okay.
Sorry, I guess I have one, and I think it'll be quick, but you know, Brad, you started, boy, it's been 2.5 hours ago or whatever, by talking about the 70 million different alternatives that we examined as part of, you know, 2019 Power with Purpose. And I bring that up because in certainly some of the public comments that we've received, they've often said, well, have you thought about this? Have you, you know, could we deploy solar wildly as fast as we can, or can we do multiple 5 megawatt projects to sort of solve the problem? I'm not looking for you to take those one by one, but I want to dispel of the myth that we didn't really think through any alternatives in this point. At this point, we just kind of said, okay, well, we're stuck, so let's just delay North Omaha. Like I want to help us understand, generally speaking, you know, the calculus for once you started to get clarity for the problem that was in front of us, and the methodology, for lack of a better term, that was used to sort of arrive at the two options that are before us today.
Sure. I appreciate the discussion around the original analysis of Power with Purpose and talking about the size of that population and how thorough we tried to be and the types of conversations that we had at that moment of time. And what we're really talking about now is, to use a golf analogy, we're in the middle of the swing. We're playing the hole we want to play. And we've already set gas assets in motion, hundreds of millions of dollars of gas assets. We have teams working darn near around the clock physically on solar sourcing. And we've got deep conviction that the solutions that we're in the midst of are spot on. They are spot on. And to be in the middle of that evolution and act like we could make a deviation is insincere. And I think from my perspective, I would like people to hear that. And I would like people to hear the focus and the intentionality, and to be able to see the progress that we've made in some of these areas, so that they can see a little bit of what I can see and what the other executive team members can see, that this is moving. This is a monster, and it's moving. And amidst the discussion around the delay, we need to make that real. And so I hope that we've done that today. We'll continue to do that, and I hope my answer is helpful.
And Brad, if I may, thank you for that, and thank you for the question, Director Moody. And this doesn't stop here. We are experiencing, OPPD is experiencing load growth that we haven't experienced in the first 76 years of our existence. So what Brad just talked about here, the solution that we very carefully analyzed and discussed, and we narrowed down 70+ million different scenarios down to the one that was presented to the board in 2019, that solves for a portion of the problem, at least through the middle of this decade. And I want to remind you and the rest of the board and the public that Brad Underwood's team in systems transformation, they are actively working on what the next iteration is going to be. We will have many opportunities for that type of interaction, for that type of input, for that IAP2 level of discussion and input that we will have from the public for future generation, right? We will go through these, and chances are we may end up with more than 70 million scenarios to start off with, and then we'll narrow it down. We'll have better technology, better information, and we'll come up with another suite of recommendations that will come to the board at some point for approval for the second round of generation investments, right? That'll probably take place in the second half of this decade. So there will be opportunities. There are always opportunities for the public to engage. These, as Brad correctly pointed out, this is not one where we are going back to the drawing board and figuring things out. Things are in motion. Times are tight. We need to complete these investments in order for us to maintain the reliability and resilience that Dan Lanahan did a wonderful job explaining at the beginning of the presentation.
Got it. Thank you.
Great. I'm not sure if there are other comments from other directors. Again, I don't see hands right now. Don't hear anyone jumping in. The only other point I would offer is following on what Brad and Javier have highlighted here. We have utility scale solutions that we are considering and moving forward now. And I have said several times in the past that it is a strong priority for me that we also evaluate small scale solutions and distribution side resources. And so as we look to the next steps here forward, as we look to the COP for 2023, I certainly hope that we can demonstrate to the public that at the utility scale, we are making the decisions necessary to maintain the reliability, as we've talked about with North Omaha Station and the SPP reserve margin, but that we also consider what additional incremental steps can be taken and how do we prioritize that as we look toward the intervening years, 23, 24, 25, 26, and we continue to make small steps forward and continue to see those graphs of emissions go down and to the right with small continuous progress on top of the large scale direction that we are moving here. I think we'll have an opportunity for additional discussion there as we get into the COP discussion at the end of the year. But I do think that that's an important point for other members of the public to keep in mind, is that we have additional mechanisms to achieve positive outcomes for the community through efficiency, distributed generation, electrification of homes and vehicles, and there will be opportunities to have that discussion as we get to the end of the year here. I don't see any additional comments about the structure now. Even as I say that, now I do see Director Yoder. Rick?
Yeah. Well, I just don't want it to go by without a comment. The commitment to environmentally sensitive energy, net zero carbon by 2050, demand side management slide. In 2014, the board approved a generation plan that had 300 megawatts of demand side management and energy efficiency. We're at 185 target for 2022 with, by the way, an increase of about 15 megawatts, but from the previous year, so well done to have that sizable increase over the previous years. But my question is, how, where are we on that goal? I'm just curious. And it kind of ties into two things. Director Williams was just talking about, not losing sight of how this kind of activity has a role in future generation. And I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Director Yoder, this is Tim McAravey, and I can try to tackle an answer to your question. To acknowledge certainly that our frame of reference for much of the discussion today has been the 2014 resolution that talked about the original plans for North Omaha, and that did include language that said reduce demand by, or reduce load by 300 megawatts. That goal has informed a number of very earnest efforts we've made over the past several years, including, but not limited to, standing up an entire organization that you all know is product development and marketing to bring solutions like that and others to our customer owners. And that group, working cross-functionally with members of Brad's team and Jeff's team, are helping to develop and deliver some of those solutions that you that you've seen on that particular slide that you referenced. Just as updated information and circumstances have informed a new recommendation around North Omaha, there was also an updated study in 2019 by the Applied Energy Group, or AEG, to help update and inform targets. So in that original study, to give an indication of the magnitude of change in the potential in that original study that helped inform the 300, that study had identified about 300 megawatts of potential by roughly 2023, I believe. And with the changes between that study, by the way, done in 2014, uses the prior 2-year information. So working now off about 10-year-old data, the 2019 study updated current conditions, or more updated conditions in terms of building codes and natural adoption, energy efficiency, et cetera. That was designed to come up with a 3-year target, 2022 being the 3rd year, and that target was that 185 in 2022. So just by rough comparison, 2014 study with about a 300 megawatt suggested potential by 2023, updated study around 185 megawatts by 2022. So that just reflects some of the changes. That said, we continue to be really focused on this. We see that this is a key component of the solution, which is why we put it in the slide today. In fact, we have teams working now to acknowledge changes in the marketplace in just the last few months, and to look at some of the, in particular, programs to update them that could be focused toward large C&I customers that could help drive some of our demand side management program adoption even faster.
Tim, I appreciate the update there. Director Yoder, did you have any? Does that address the question that you had raised?
I thank you for the information. So if I were to stay today, pardon me if you just said this, Tim, and it didn't sink in. What would be the current demand side management goal that we have?
So as depicted on the slide, we have a goal for the end of 2022 at 185 megawatts. We are largely on target to achieve that. The study of 2019 did an extrapolation out for the next couple of years. And I refer to it as an extrapolation because we didn't continue to plan specific programs. We have them planned, as we see on the slide, but didn't correlate them specifically. But that would suggest that the potential of growing it another 12 to 15 megawatts over the next couple of years. So it did not come out with a achievable horizon of 300 anytime in the foreseeable future. With that said, I want to reiterate, Director Yoder, that what we are intending to include in there is to acknowledge the continued emphasis on DSM, that we have programs, products, and services that we're working to develop, and we are also re-examining ones that are currently in the field to update them for current market conditions and to see if we can accelerate adoption of some of those programs. So I hope that helps to answer the question and I interpreted it correctly.
That helps answer that question. Thank you.
Great. Appreciate the clarification. Okay, so with that, I don't see any additional hands, hear any additional comments. We did discuss a couple of things that I think were not part of the slide presentation, but the board will coordinate with the executive leadership team about the next steps that we had highlighted regarding language in the resolution and next steps about additional policy work, just to make sure that by Thursday we're all clear on what is included, what is anticipated for the resolution and the recommended vote on Thursday, and what additional things will occur related but somewhat outside of that, including community engagements, as well as additional updates about operations and additional ways that we are going to improve and reduce our emissions moving forward. So those things were not specifically included in the slides, but I did want to summarize them just to make sure that we are all on the same page here. Something we talked about in governance is making sure that we're clear about where we expect things to move forward. So with that, I think that we have concluded this item. I appreciate everyone with the longevity to to get this wrapped up significantly over time. So thank you to the team for all of your work to present, answer questions, prepare the recommendation so that we can do what's in the best interest of the community and be ready for consideration of the action on Thursday.